Terminal cancer had already stolen his childhood, his hair, and his future. Now it was coming for his final breath. But 16-year-old Connor didn't want a trip to Disneyland or a celebrity meet and greet. His dying wish was so dangerous, the hospital administration threatened to call the police. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a sickening, relentless hum inside room 412 of Spokane Memorial Hospital. 16-year-old Connor Bradley lay drowning in the crisp, bleached white center of a mechanical bed. Osteosarcoma, a brutal, fast-moving bone cancer, had ravaged his once athletic frame, whittling him down to a mere 74 pounds. His skin carried the translucent, bruised pallor of parchment paper left out in the rain, and the amputation of his right leg a year prior had done nothing to stop the relentless march of the disease into his lungs. Beside him, clutching a hand that felt more like a bundle of brittle twigs, sat his mother, Sarah. Sarah had not slept a full night in 11 months. Her eyes were rimmed with deep, dark shadows, and the constant sterile scent of rubbing alcohol floor wax and metallic blood seemed permanently etched into her clothes. She had fought every insurance company, begged every experimental trial director on the West Coast, and prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. None of it had worked. Now they were firmly trapped in the grim, suffocating twilight of palliative care. Dr. Kenneth Harrison, a profoundly kind but visibly exhausted pediatric oncologist, had pulled Sarah into the hallway just after dawn. His words still rang in her ears, vibrating like a death knell in the quiet ward. "Organ failure has begun, Sarah. We are talking days, maybe hours. It is time to let go of the fight and just make him comfortable." Making him comfortable meant fulfilling his final wish. But Connor's dying request had sent the hospital administration into an absolute tailspin. Chloe Bennett, a young and normally endlessly optimistic coordinator for the local Children's Wish Foundation, stood at the foot of Connor's bed, nervously adjusting her clipboard. She looked as though she was about to cry. "Sarah, I am so incredibly sorry," Chloe whispered, leaning in so the boy wouldn't hear. "We can get him a private video call with the governor. We can get front-row VIP tickets to any sporting event, or even arrange for a private acoustic set from that rock band he used to love. But my regional director rejected the application outright. Corporate policy explicitly forbids us from sanctioning or organizing any contact with a designated outlaw motorcycle club." Connor, despite his shallow, rattling breaths, had remarkably sharp hearing. He weakly turned his head against the thin hospital pillow. "I don't want the governor." He rasped his voice, barely louder than the steady hiss of his oxygen cannula. "I want the Hells Angels, the Spokane Charter." Sarah gently stroked her son's bald head, her heart shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Why them, baby? Why the bikers?" Connor swallowed hard, wincing as the movement pulled at his chest. He reached underneath his pillow with a trembling skeletal hand and pulled out a small, heavy object. He pressed it into Sarah's palm. It was a tarnished silver challenge coin, heavily embossed with the infamous winged death head logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. "Dad's toolbox," Connor whispered, fighting for air. "I found it before I got sick. Dad used to take me on the tank of his bike when I was little. I remember the sound. I remember how the ground shook, but I also remember how people looked at him. I need to know, Mom. I need to know if my father was a bad man. I need them to tell me." Sarah stared at the heavy silver coin, a cold wave of nausea washing over her. Michael Bradley Connor's father had died in a horrific motorcycle crash on a rain-slicked highway 12 years ago. Michael was never a fully patched member, at least not to Sarah's knowledge, but he had been a prospect, a mechanic, who spent far too much time repairing stolen bikes and running errands for dangerous men. She had hated that life. She had blamed the club for Michael's death, believing their illegal midnight run had pushed her husband into the storm that ultimately killed him. She had spent a decade shielding Connor from that dark, violent underworld. Suddenly the door to room 412 swung violently open. Brenda Higgins, the hospital's senior administrator, marched in with her arms crossed, her expression a mask of bureaucratic fury. "Mrs. Bradley, I want to make this perfectly clear," Brenda snapped, ignoring the dying boy in the bed. "If you somehow manage to contact these criminals, and if those gang members step 1 foot onto hospital property, I will immediately have them arrested for trespassing. This is a secure pediatric oncology ward, not a biker bar. I will absolutely not compromise the safety of our staff and other patients for this absurd stunt." Sarah looked from the furious administrator to the heartbroken, fading eyes of her only child. The monitors beeped in a slow, agonizing rhythm. Connor didn't have time for bureaucracy. He didn't have time for safety protocols. He was leaving this world, and he was terrified of what he was leaving behind. Sarah closed her fist around the heavy silver coin. The desperation of a mother watching her child die was a terrifying, uncontrollable force. She stood up, her posture, straightening her exhausted eyes, flashing with a sudden, dangerous resolve. "Watch him," Sarah ordered Nurse Clara Jenkins, who had been quietly checking Connor's IV drip. Without another word to the administrator, Sarah grabbed her car keys, her worn leather purse, and walked out of the hospital. She was going to do the unthinkable. She was going to walk straight into the lion's den. Rain violently lashed against the cracked windshield of Sarah's battered 2010 Honda Civic as she navigated the bleak, decaying, industrial outskirts of East Spokane. The transition from the sterile, hushed, brightly lit corridors of the hospital to this desolate stretch of town felt like crossing the River Styx into another dimension. Abandoned warehouses, flickering streetlights, and rusted chain-link fences lined the flooded streets. She finally pulled into a gravel lot, heavily fortified by concrete barriers and a 10-foot fence topped with coiled, rusted barbed wire. Beyond the imposing gate sat a sprawling, windowless warehouse painted entirely in matte black. Several massive custom Harley-Davidson motorcycles were parked in a neat, gleaming row under a corrugated tin awning. A large red and white sign hung ominously over the reinforced steel door. Hell's Angels MC, Spokane Charter. Sarah's hands trembled so violently she could barely shove the gearshift into park. She was utterly terrified. The men inside that building were notorious. They were frequently on the evening news for drug trafficking, violent turf wars, and federal racketeering charges. But the haunting image of Connor's hollowed-out face and the desperate rattling sound of his breathing pushed her out of the driver's seat. As soon as her boots hit the wet gravel, the heavy steel door of the warehouse swung open. A massive, heavily tattooed man with a thick, scarred neck stepped out into the rain. His leather cut bore the patch of Sergeant-at-Arms. This was Iron Dave Rollins. He crossed his massive arms, blocking her path, his eyes narrowing in hostility. "You're lost, lady," Dave growled, his voice, a deep, gravelly rumble that easily competed with the thunder overhead. "Turn the car around. I need to speak to your president." Sarah said, her voice shaking but refusing to break. "My son is dying." Dave didn't flinch. "Hospital is 4 miles west. We don't have doctors here. Leave." Sarah reached into her pocket, pulled out the tarnished silver death head coin, and held it up in the freezing rain. "My husband was Michael Bradley. Please." Dave's expression instantly froze. He stared at the coin, then looked closely at Sarah's desperate, rain-soaked face. Without saying another word, he aggressively grabbed her arm, unlocked the gate, and marched her toward the dark, imposing warehouse. The interior of the clubhouse was a sensory assault. It smelled thickly of stale beer, motor oil, cheap cigarette smoke and wet leather. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner, but the music was abruptly cut off the moment Dave hauled Sarah into the main room. Dozens of rough, intimidating men stopped what they were doing. Pool cues were lowered. Beer bottles were set down on the scarred wooden bar. Total suffocating silence fell over the room as every eye locked onto the terrified suburban mother. Sitting at the head of a massive oak table in the center of the room was Thomas Grizzly Henderson. He was the chapter president, a towering, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a thick grey beard, cold blue eyes, and a face mapped with the scars of a violent, unforgiving life. He slowly stood up, placing his hands on the table. "Dave, why is there a civilian in my clubhouse?" Grizzly demanded, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "She brought this," Dave said, tossing the silver coin onto the oak table. It clattered loudly, spinning, before coming to a rest right in front of Grizzly. Grizzly looked down at the coin. The atmosphere in the room plummeted 10 degrees. The tension was so thick Sarah could barely draw breath. Grizzly's cold blue eyes slowly rose to meet Sarah's. "Where did you get this?" Grizzly asked. "I found it in my husband's toolbox." Sarah pleaded, tears finally mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Michael Bradley. He died 12 years ago." Grizzly's jaw clenched. The men surrounding him shifted uncomfortably, exchanging dark, knowing glances. Grizzly slowly picked up the coin, rolling it between his calloused, heavily ringed fingers. "I know exactly who Michael Bradley was," Grizzly said, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. "He was a coward. He was skimming club money from the garage. When we found out, he panicked, stole a bike, and tried to run in the middle of a thunderstorm. That coin is a marker. He owed this club a debt he never paid. He cost this chapter a lot of blood, Mrs. Bradley." Sarah gasped, taking a step back, as if she had been physically struck. Her husband hadn't been an innocent victim of a tragic accident. He had been a thief running from the club's vengeance. "I didn't know," Sarah sobbed, her knees threatening to buckle. "I swear to God I didn't know. But my son, Connor, is 16 years old. He weighs 70 pounds. He has terminal bone cancer, and they gave him 48 hours to live. His final wish is to meet you, to hear the bikes, to know if his father was a monster." She fell to her knees on the filthy floor, completely breaking down. "I am begging you. He is just a boy. Punish me for what Michael did, but please don't let my son die thinking he comes from nothing but bad blood. Please." Grizzly stared down at the weeping mother. His expression remained incredibly hardened, a mask of unyielding stone. He tossed the silver coin back onto the floor, where it landed inches from Sarah's knees. "Get her out of here," Grizzly ordered, turning his back to her and walking toward the bar. "We aren't a charity, we aren't a petting zoo, and we sure as hell don't ride for thieves." Dave grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, hauling her roughly to her feet. "Come on, lady. Time to go." Sarah was practically dragged out into the freezing rain and shoved back toward her car. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, the locking mechanism echoing like a gunshot in the empty lot. She collapsed against the hood of her Honda, sobbing uncontrollably. She had completely failed. She had abandoned her dying son in his final hours, only to discover her dead husband's horrific secret. And she had nothing to show for it. The drive back to Spokane Memorial was a blur of tears and crushing, suffocating despair. When Sarah finally ran back into room 412, the situation had deteriorated drastically. Connor was now hooked up to 3 new monitors, all of them flashing urgent, terrifying warnings. Dr. Harrison stood by the bed, his face pale and somber. He looked up as Sarah rushed in, soaking wet and trembling. His lungs are filling with fluid rapidly, Sarah, Dr. Harrison said softly. We've had to start the highest dosage morphine drip. I am so sorry. He won't make it through the night. Sarah rushed to the bedside, falling into the chair and burying her face in the thin hospital blankets, weeping over her son's frail, motionless legs. Slowly, agonizingly, Connor's eyelids fluttered open. The heavy narcotics clouded his vision, but he found his mother's face. He could barely pull enough air into his lungs to speak. "Mum." Connor whispered, a single tear rolling down his hollow cheek. "Are they coming?" Sarah gripped his brittle hand, her heart entirely shattered, and told the most painful lie of her life. "They're trying, baby. They're trying." Shadows lengthened across the sterile walls of room 412 as midnight crept into the pediatric oncology ward with the heavy, suffocating weight of an executioner. The violent storm raging outside Spokane Memorial Hospital showed no signs of breaking. Rain continuously battered the reinforced glass, acting as a grim, relentless metronome to the fading, erratic rhythm of Connor's heart monitor. Inside the room, the only other sound was the devastating, wet rattle of the 16-year-old boy fighting for his final breaths. Sarah sat absolutely paralyzed in the hard plastic chair beside his bed. She had spent the last 6 hours watching her only child slip further away into the heavy fog of maximum-dose morphine. Her earlier desperate expedition to the Hells Angels clubhouse now felt like a fevered dream, a foolish, humiliating failure that had only robbed her of precious time with her son. She gripped Connor's skeletal hand, her thumb tracing the fragile blue veins underneath his translucent skin. She silently cursed Michael, her dead husband, for leaving behind a legacy of theft and betrayal that had ultimately denied their son his dying wish. Dr. Kenneth Harrison quietly stepped into the room, his white coat catching the dim fluorescent light from the hallway. He checked the IV lines, his face drawn tight with professional grief. He didn't need to speak. The deep sorrow in his eyes told Sarah everything she needed to know. Organ failure was nearly complete. Just outside the doorway, Brenda Higgins stood with her arms rigidly crossed over her clipboard. The hospital administrator cast a fleeting, almost relieved glance into the room. She leaned closer to Nurse Jenkins and whispered, her voice carrying easily in the quiet ward. "It really is for the best. It's tragic, of course, but bringing a violent motorcycle gang into a secure hospital wing was a completely deranged idea. We avoided a massive liability tonight." Sarah heard the cruel bureaucratic dismissal, but she lacked the energy to fight back. She buried her face into the thin hospital blanket, preparing herself for the moment the monitor would flatline. Then at exactly 1:14 a.m., the half-empty plastic cup of water resting on Connor's bedside table began to vibrate. It was incredibly subtle at first, a faint, rhythmic ripple across the surface of the water. Sarah blinked, raising her head. The floor beneath her boots seemed to hum with a low, unnatural frequency. It didn't sound like the thunder echoing from the storm clouds above. It felt mechanical, grounded, and terrifyingly powerful. "Doctor," Harrison paused, his hand hovering over the heart monitor. "Do you feel that?" he murmured, looking toward the window. The low hum rapidly intensified into a deep, guttural growl. The heavy glass panes of the hospital window began to rattle violently within their metal frames. Out in the hallway, the nurses' station erupted into sudden, panicked confusion. Alarms from the cars parked in the massive lower lot began blaring in a chaotic chorus, triggered by a massive seismic disturbance. Brenda Higgins marched toward the window at the end of the corridor, irritation flashing across her face. What on earth is that noise? Is there a problem with the emergency generators? She pressed her hands against the glass and looked down at the rain-flooded streets leading to the hospital entrance. Her jaw dropped, all the color instantly drained from her face. Cutting through the torrential rain and the absolute pitch-black darkness of the night were headlights. Not just 5 or 10, hundreds of them. A massive, endless river of roaring steel and blinding chrome was flooding up the main access road. The Spokane charter of the Hells Angels hadn't just ignored Sarah's plea, they had spent the last 4 hours making phone calls. They had mobilized the Seattle charter, the Portland charter, and every nomad rider within a 200-mile radius. Over 300 heavily customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles rode in a terrifying, perfectly synchronized formation, their engines screaming in a unified, thunderous roar that shook the very foundation of the multi-story hospital. They bypassed the visitor lot, entirely hopping the curbs and parking directly on the manicured front lawns, the ambulance bays, and the main entrance plaza. The roaring of the massive V-twin engines was deafening, a visceral, earth-shaking declaration of arrival that drowned out the thunder above. Inside room 412, Connor's heavily medicated eyes slowly fluttered open. The deep vibration rattled his bed frame. A faint, trembling smile touched his pale, chapped lips. "Mum, do you hear them?" Sarah rushed to the window, pressing her trembling hands against the cold glass. Tears streamed down her face as she looked down at the sea of leather and roaring engines. "I hear them, baby. They came." Down in the lobby, pure chaos erupted. Hospital security guards frantically shouted into their radios, completely overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the outlaw bikers dismounting their rides in the freezing rain. Brenda Higgins grabbed a telephone from the nurse's station, her fingers shaking wildly as she dialed 911. "We are under siege." Brenda screamed into the receiver. "I need every available police unit to Spokane Memorial immediately. The Hells Angels are breaching the front doors." The automatic sliding glass doors of the main lobby hissed open, letting in a violent gust of wind rain and the overpowering stench of hot exhaust and wet leather. Thomas Grizzly Henderson strode into the pristine, brightly lit hospital lobby. He was flanked by 10 of his highest-ranking officers, all massive, battle-scarred men dripping rainwater onto the polished linoleum floor. 2 hospital security guards instinctively stepped forward, resting their hands nervously on their pepper spray holsters. Grizzly didn't even slow down. He simply looked at them with his cold, unyielding blue eyes. The sheer, overwhelming aura of danger radiating from the men was enough. The guard swallowed hard and slowly stepped aside, letting the giants pass. Brenda Higgins, completely abandoning her post on the 4th floor, burst out of the lobby elevator. She stood directly in Grizzly's path, holding her clipboard like a pathetic plastic shield. "Stop right there," Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. "You are trespassing on private property. The police are literally 2 minutes away. If you take one more step toward the pediatric ward, you will all go to federal prison." Grizzly stopped. He towered over the furious administrator. He slowly reached into his soaked leather cut and pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills, dropping it onto the reception desk with a heavy thud. "That's for whatever mud we track onto your floors," Grizzly rumbled, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "Call the mayor. Call the National Guard. I don't care. But if you try to stop me from walking into room 412, I will throw you through that front window." Brenda stumbled backward, terrified into absolute silence. Grizzly and his men bypassed the elevators, their heavy steel-toed boots echoing like a military drumbeat as they marched up the 4 flights of emergency stairs. When the imposing crew finally stepped onto the oncology ward, the frantic medical staff froze. Nurses pressed themselves against the walls. But Dr. Harrison stepped forward, nodding respectfully to Grizzly, and silently pointed toward Connor's room. Sarah stood by the bed, utterly speechless, as the giant, terrifying outlaw ducked his head to enter the small hospital room. The remaining bikers stood guard in the hallway, creating an impenetrable wall of leather and muscle. Grizzly walked slowly toward the mechanical bed. The harsh hospital lights illuminated the deep scars on his face and the heavy silver rings on his fingers. He looked down at the frail skeletal boy, listening to the agonizing rattle in Connor's chest. "You?" Connor Grizzly asked softly, the deep gravel of his voice completely stripped of its usual malice. Connor nodded weakly, fighting past the heavy fog of the narcotics. "You're the president." "I am," Grizzly replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver death head coin Sarah had brought to the clubhouse. He held it up so the dying boy could see it. "Your mother came to see me," Grizzly said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. He sat down, leaning his massive elbows on his knees. "She brought me this. Told me you wanted to know about your old man. You wanted to know if Michael Bradley was a bad guy." Sarah held her breath, her fingernails digging violently into her palms. She prepared herself for the devastating truth, bracing for the moment this ruthless biker would destroy her dying son's final illusion of his father. Grizzly looked up at Sarah, a strange, profound understanding passing between them. Then he looked back down at the boy. "Your old man rode hard, kid," Grizzly said, his voice carrying the solemn weight of a preacher delivering a eulogy. "He wasn't a saint. None of us are. But he loved you more than he loved breathing." The night he died. He didn't die running away like a coward. We were pinned down in a bad spot with rival clubs. Your dad took a bike into the worst storm of the decade to draw them off to protect the club. He sacrificed himself so his brothers could live. Sarah gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth as tears cascaded down her cheeks. It was a complete lie. It was a beautiful, monumental, redeeming lie. Grizzly was actively rewriting history, sacrificing the club's brutal demand for vengeance just to give a dying 16-year-old boy peace. Connor's eyes widened, a fragile spark of profound pride lighting up his exhausted, sunken face. He was a hero. He was a brother, Grizzly corrected gently. And in our world, debts have to be paid. Your dad bought our lives with his. Now we owe you. Grizzly stood up. He reached up and began unbuttoning his heavy leather cut, the sacred blood-stained vest that held his president patches. Taking off a cut and giving it to an outsider was the absolute highest honor a club member could bestow an act strictly forbidden by their violent underworld laws. Grizzly didn't care. He slipped the heavy leather vest off his massive shoulders and gently draped it over Connor's frail chest. It practically swallowed the boy, smelling of freedom, gasoline, and open highways. "You have his blood," Connor Grizzly whispered, resting his giant, calloused hand over the boy's rapidly fading heart, "which means you have the heart of a lion. You are patched in. You ride with us now, little brother." Connor weakly reached up his trembling skeletal fingers, brushing against the embroidered, winged death head patch on the chest. The profound terror and anxiety that had plagued his final weeks completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, absolute peace. He finally knew who he was. He was the son of a brave man. Grizzly pulled a small two-way radio from his belt and brought it to his mouth. "Let him hear it," he commanded into the static. Outside the hospital, down in the flooded parking lots and front lawns, 300 bikers simultaneously cranked their throttles. The explosion of mechanical sound was apocalyptic. The deafening synchronized roar of 300 Harley-Davidson engines shattered the night, vibrating the walls, rattling the medical equipment, and drowning out the howling storm. It was a thunderous 21-gun salute made of gasoline and steel, roaring up to the 4th floor in a glorious symphony of raw power. Connor closed his eyes, completely enveloped in the heavy leather vest and the earth-shaking vibration he remembered from his earliest childhood memories. A soft, contented smile finally settled on his face. As the glorious roar of the engines reached its absolute peak, the heart monitor beside the bed emitted a single continuous tone. Connor was gone. Sarah collapsed against Grizzly's side, sobbing uncontrollably. The massive biker didn't flinch. He wrapped his heavy, scarred arm around the grieving mother, holding her steady as she shattered. "He rode out brave?" Mom Grizzly murmured over the blaring of the flatline alarm. "Debt's completely settled. Grizzly and 300 bikers giving a dying boy the ultimate hero's farewell proves that true honor often hides behind the toughest exteriors. This incredibly powerful story reminds us that compassion can rewrite history and heal shattered hearts in their final moments." If Connor and Grizzly's unforgettable moment moved you to tears, please like this video, share it with your friends to spread the message of unexpected kindness, and subscribe for more incredible true life stories. Drop a comment below to honor Connor's ride.